The Sun King was not supposed to rot, but in the summer of 1715, the Palace of Versailles became a golden coffin. Behind silk curtains and marble corridors, the most powerful man in Europe began to decay alive. First came the limp, then the swelling, then the blackened flesh. His doctors whispered of sciatica. They were wrong. The truth was gangrene ravenous, relentless, and unchecked. For 23 days, Louis XIV lay consumed by infection, the smell of death bleeding through perfume and protocol. Courtiers held their breath. The king held on. As his leg rotted beneath the sheets, so too did the illusion of immortality. This is the story of how a god on earth died like a man in agony, in darkness and alone. They called him the Sun King, not merely for his glory, but for how he arranged the world to orbit him precisely, obediently, eternally. But behind that celestial mask was a man who had spent decades rehearsing immortality and ignoring the rot that always threatened to bloom beneath the velvet robes. From the moment Louis XIV claimed absolute power after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, he made monarchy a theater, and himself the star, standing at the center of Versailles in silk heels and powdered wigs, directing ministers like dancers, baptizing war with ceremony, and binding obedience with etiquette so suffocatingly detailed that even silence had protocol. And yet the very body that anchored this solar system was already fragilely, his teeth gone, his gums raw and suppurating, his digestive system so unstable that he endured regular enemas and secret hemorrhages, his meals monitored, his stools noted by court doctors with trembling pens, all while he floated through marble halls like a living god, impervious to winter, pain, or rebellion. The king danced in ballets long after youth abandoned him, limping through Lully's courtly compositions, clutching to the memory of Apollo as gout gnawed at his bones and kidney stones carved paths of agony through his insides. But no one could name it aloud, for in Versailles the illusion of perfection was law, and truth, especially biological truth, was treasonous. The wars he waged abroad mirrored the ones inside his flesh, costly, endless, and justified by grandeur, as his campaigns against the Dutch, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish crowned him with glory but bled France dry. And so too did his body demand tribute surgeons, elixirs, phlebotomies, and nightly rituals designed to mask what no crown could prevent. When his beloved Queen Maria Theresa died, he did not weep publicly, for grief would unmask the man. And when his numerous mistresses fell from favor or succumbed to illness, they were replaced as seamlessly as footmen emotions concealed beneath ceremony, like pus beneath powder. His reign was an act of relentless transformation, turning fallibility into mythology, mistakes into marble, ulcers into incense. And with each passing year, the distance between the man and the monument widened until even his closest attendants began to forget the warmth of his hands or the falter in his voice. To the court, he was a statue in motion, a king without weakness, but to his body a treacherous, aching vessel. He was a prisoner, bound by time, bloated by ritual, aging in public yet unable to die without disrupting the myth he had so carefully composed. And so when his leg began to swell in the late summer of 1715, it was not merely an infection, it was heresy, a violation of the natural order he had spent 70 years dictating. And yet, as the smell of rot began to thicken behind the silks, no one dared call it what it was. For to name the decay was to extinguish the sun itself. The diagnosis was a fiction, and everyone knew it, though none would dare admit it aloud. Not the physicians who bowed lower than they examined, not the courtiers who praised the king's endurance while gagging on the stench of infection, not the mistresses who whispered reassurances from behind lace fans as the sovereign's leg turned purple, then black, and began to leak the scent of finality. When Louis complained of a searing pain in his left leg, Fagin, the royal physician, offered a diagnosis so benign it bordered on absurdity. Sciatica? A common affliction of age, he said with a tremble behind his powdered mask. And to treat it, he prescribed camphorated compresses, sweetened donkey milk, and holy relics pressed against the swollen limbus, though a saint's finger bone might cauterize gangrene, as though ritual could reverse necrosis. In truth, they treated not the king but the myth of the king, terrified of puncturing the illusion that Louis, the sun incarnate, was beyond the reach of decay. At Versailles, pain could be hidden behind a curtain, wrought beneath embroidery, and so the leg fowl, tender, pulsing with heat, was spoken of in euphemism, wrapped in gauze and silence. The physicians lied to protect their station, the courtiers lied to protect their futures, and the king, half aware, perhaps wholly aware, permitted the lie because truth would end him faster than any infection. And so the charade intensified. Each failed remedy followed by another, prayers whispered into ivory crucifixes, ointments blessed by trembling abbots, poultices mixed with powdered pearl sand. When none of it worked, they offered leeches, bloodletting, and ever more opiates, hoping to drain the illness without naming it. Servants, choking back bile, changed his sheets thrice daily, yet nothing could mask the scent, sweet and sulfurous, that clung to the drapes and settled like ash on the mirrors. Even the fountains of Versailles, forever roaring with grandeur, seemed quieter, subdued by something unspoken. But no one dared speak it, not the Duc d'Orléans, not Madame de Maintenon, not even Maréchal, the chief surgeon, who bit his tongue until it bled, knowing that to challenge Fagin's authority would risk more than disgrace. It would risk blame if the sun extinguished under their watch. And so, as the king's appetite waned, as he winced with every movement and gasped during ceremonial prayers, the court continued its minuet of denial. Musicians played as scheduled, the royal hunts proceeded with diminished fervor, diplomats were received in rooms where the curtains were drawn tighter and the candles burned stronger to mask what hung in the air. Versailles, always a theater, now played out a tragedy in slow motion, where the protagonist decayed on stage while the audience clapped politely and held perfumed cloths to their faces. And still, the king endured, a creature of habit and pride, refusing to collapse, refusing to rage, his leg a rotting oracle no one wished to hear, because if Louis XIV, the unburnable sun, could putrefy before their eyes, then what hope had they, the lesser moons, of escaping the same fate? By the second week of his illness, no perfumer in France could mask it. The air in the royal bedchamber had turned sour, heavy, sickly, sweet, like rotting fruit left beneath silk, and no incense nor rosewater could quell the unmistakable odor of dying flesh. Gangrene had declared itself beyond all denial, creeping up from the ankle to the calf with a bloated, purplish vengeance, and still the courtiers spoke in riddles, calling it the swelling, the affliction, anything but what it was. A necrosis so aggressive that even the sheets rebelled, soaked hourly with ichor and pus, requiring constant replacement by servants whose stomachs knotted behind practiced masks of stoic servitude. The stink clung to every tapestry and drifted down marble corridors, a morbid messenger that whispered of mortality in the halls of eternal glory. Chambermaids collapsed from the fumes, maids of honor murmured behind painted fans, and yet the official line held. The king was merely unwell, a passing infirmity, nothing to cause alarm, but those close enough to the bed knew better. For the king's leg had become a wound that breathed, that spoke, that warned of approaching death with every oozing drop. Physicians, desperate to contain appearances, drenched him in camphorated spirits, wrapped the limb in fresh linens doused in vinegar. But the smell returned each time, stronger, angrier, as though the disease had become sentient, enraged by denial. And yet, amid this bio-horror, Louis XIV insisted on order, insisted on ritual, insisted most of Allen Mass. And so, supported by footmen, he shuffled into the royal chapel, swathed in lace and gold, his face pale beneath layers of white powder, his breath shallow, his left leg dragging slightly behind him like a corpse refusing burial, while courtiers bowed and choristers sang hymns to a god who must have turned his face from the spectacle long ago. Some dared not meet his eyes, afraid they might see not a king, but a carcass in waiting. Others wept, not out of love, but out of terror, because if the king could die, the monarchy itself might rot from the inside out. And still, the ritual continued. Candles were lit, genuflections performed, Latin whispered, as if ceremony could bind the soul to a body already halfway gone. Rumors seeped through the palace like the stench itself. Was it a punishment? A divine retribution for his wars, his mistresses, his pride? But such thoughts were never spoken above a whisper, for fear that death might overhear and quicken its pace. Even Madame de Maintenon, long his closest confidant, now lingered less at his side, her letters suddenly full of saints and resignation. Versailles, once a palace of illusions, had become a crypt with chandeliers, where mirrors reflected not majesty, but meat decaying beneath velvet. And as Louis clutched his prayer book with trembling hands, nodding solemnly as the priest intoned the gospel, the blackened limb beneath his robes pulsed and oozed with every heartbeat a silent testimony to the delusion that power could preserve flesh, that ritual could reverse rot, that kings could be more than men. It was Georges Mareschal, the king's first surgeon, who at last broke the sacred silence, stepping through the perfumed fog of denial, with the weight of truth pressing against his chest like a stone. For no amount of ceremony could conceal what his instruments and his eyes had already confirmed. The king's leg was dead, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally, grotesquely dead. Its flesh black and brittle, its odor unmistakable, its tissue no longer part of the living world but a province of rot and ruin. He named it what it was: mortification, faceless, words that struck like thunder in the gilded sickroom, words that shattered the elaborate dance of euphemism that had so far protected not the king, but the fragile dignity of those around him. The diagnosis was not met with action, but with paralysis, for what followed was not a decision born of medicine, but a war of hierarchy and cowardice, a whispered debate across brocade pillows and candlelit alcoves, as courtiers weighed not the risks to the king's life, but the risks to their own standing should the blade fail or succeed too well. Mareschal urged amputation, begged it, argued that to remove the leg might yet save the sovereign's body and stall the procession of death, but his colleagues, chief among them Fagin, whose pride was as inflamed as the king's limb resisted, claiming the patient was too old, too frail, that the surgery itself would hasten death more surely than the rot. Others, terrified of being remembered as the men who dismembered the Sun King, hedged and dissembled, cloaking indecision in pious concern and deference to fate. All the while, the king himself listened in silence, his breath shallow, his face unreadable, perhaps too exhausted to speak, or perhaps too proud to choose between agony and mutilation. And so the moment passed, the chance to act dissolved like vapor in the sickroom, and with it, any hope of reversal. The leg remained, pulsing with infection, a dead weight tethered to a dying body, its corruption leaching inward hour by hour, blackening not just skin, but blood, not just tissue, but time. Mareschal, defeated, returned to his tools and tried what he could: more compresses, stronger spirits, incisions to drain the poison. But the leg was no longer a part of the king. It was a kingdom lost, a territory claimed by death, and its borders were expanding. Yet Versailles did not halt. Servants still scrubbed marble floors, musicians still played minuets, and nobles still curtsied and schemed and whispered only. Now their eyes darted toward the bed with a new urgency, a recognition that the unthinkable was no longer distant, that the God-King was not only fallible, but perishable. In the days that followed, Marechal's verdict became an open secret, one that echoed through tapestries and lingered behind every bow. The king was dying, and they had chosen not to stop it. He had spent 70 years staging power, and he would stage death no differently. So, when Louis XIV finally acknowledged what his body had long been screaming, he did so with a majesty that blurred mortality into ritual, rot into rite. For even as his leg festered and his lips cracked with fever, he summoned the priests, the relics, the golden chalice, and the royal confessor to orchestrate what would become the final performance of a life devoted to appearances. The viaticum was prepared bread and wine, not just for the soul, but for the eyes of the court, who gathered in hushed reverence, not merely to witness salvation, but to ensure the choreography of death matched the perfection of rule. Cardinal de Rohan, heavy in crimson and trembling beneath the weight of symbolism, administered the last rites in a chamber thick with incense and expectation, his Latin syllables echoing through a room where every shadow held a breathless noble, watching not for grace, but for precedent. The king, ever a master of stagecraft, received the sacraments with regal solemnity, eyes closed, hands folded, not flinching even as his leg pulsed with putrefaction beneath the bedclothes. Would die, yes, but only when the script allowed, and only after every scene had been played with poise. His confession followed, whispered into the ear of a priest who would carry secrets into eternity. Yet even in that moment of sacred vulnerability, There were lines left unsaid, sins that would remain embalmed in silence, not out of forgetfulness, but control. For Louis confessed only what suited the memory he intended to leave behind. The mistresses were acknowledged, perhaps, the vanity, the pageantry, but not the wars that crippled France, not the children he disowned or the famines he ignored, not the cost of grandeur paid in flesh and bone by peasants whose names he never learned. What mattered now was not penance, but posterity, and so he choreographed his final days like a royal ballet, directing courtiers with nods, timing visits to ensure dignity, dictating final proclamations from bed, with a voice hoarse yet unbroken. Behind the walls, surgeons whispered of the spreading gangrene, of blackened bowels and sour breath, of a body losing its grip on cohesion, but to the court, he remained the monarch, spine erect on the pillows, robes arranged to obscure the worst of it, a waxwork of power kept animate by sheer force of will. Musicians played softly in the antechamber. The courtiers entered one by one to kiss his hand, and the air was thick not with grief, but with awe, because here was a man commanding death, as he had commanded life, not begging for mercy, but orchestrating legacy. And so, as the candles flickered and the rosary beads slid between parchment fingers, the theater of decline unfolded in perfect sequence, a masterpiece of sacred control. And though the body beneath the silks was rotting hour by hour, the man within still pulled the strings, determined that his exit, like his reign, be absolute. On a late August morning, beneath the painted ceiling of his chamber and the gaze of gods rendered in gold leaf, Louis XIV summoned the boy who would inherit the crumbling edifice of his Gloria, 5-year-old child dressed in stiff brocade, trembling beneath a wig too heavy for his small frame, the future Louis XV, led by attendants into a room where the air itself felt bruised by history. The king, propped upright by embroidered pillows, face waxen but eyes still burning with authority, regarded the boy with a gaze sharpened by pain and prophecy. And then, with the court listening from behind half-open doors and the chroniclers poised to immortalize the exchange, he spoke not with fire, but with fatal clarity, his voice the brittle echo of a man whose flesh betrayed him, but whose pride refused surrender. "Do not imitate me in war," he murmured, each word coated in the weight of unspoken corpses, of ruined harvests and hollowed cities. And the boy, too young to understand but old enough to feel the gravity, nodded with a solemnity that did not belong to children. "Seek to relieve the misery of your people," Louis continued, and here the mask cracked not into repentance, never that, but into something older and sadder, a ghost of regret, a shadow that flickered across a monarch who had once bathed France in glory and blood without distinction. And yet, for all its apparent humility, the speech was a curation, not a confession. There was no mention of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, no remorse for the Huguenot persecutions, no sorrow for the bankrupting of the treasury or the starvation in the provinces. He spoke not of Madame de Maintenon, whose influence blurred church and state, nor of the countless sons he legitimized and then sidelined. No, this was not an account of sins, but a lesson in optics, a final act of control disguised as wisdom. And the boy, the tiny body into whom all the ambition and failure of an empire were now funneled, looked up with wide eyes, as if trying to absorb the burden through silence alone. It was a moment rich in symbolism, drenched in the fragrance of dying lilies and ceremonial myrrh. And though the rot continued to devour the king's body beneath the sheets, here he appeared eternal, a dying god passing fire to a mortal too small to hold it. When the audience ended, the boy was led away like a sacred relic, his footsteps swallowed by velvet rugs, and the king, having staged his own transfiguration, lay back against his pillows, not eased, but affirmed as if by instructing the future, he could rewrite the past. And in that room of tapestries and shadows, where incense curled like smoke from an extinguished flame, a myth began to settle over the man, a myth woven not from truth, but from timing, posture, and the silence of those too young to ask the questions that history one day would. They came in waves, powdered and perfumed, their faces rigid with reverence but their eyes flickering with calculation, nobles and ministers, bishops and bastards, each summoned to the side of a man who had once embodied France and now resembled something between relic and corpse, A king whose breath rattled like rusted iron beneath embroidered sheets, whose skin clung to bone like melted wax. The ritual of presence demanded the ecumeno to speak, for the king could barely whisper, nor to serve, for service was no longer needed, but to be seen, to be counted among the final witnesses, to harvest proximity like a dying sun, still offering its last rays to the clever. One by one they bowed, kissed the trembling hand, muttered phrases of loyalty they no longer felt, while just beyond the bedchamber, in corridors echoing with muffled heels and the dry rustle of satin, new alliances bloomed like mold. Already, glances were cast toward Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the likely regent, a man whose presence at court had been tolerated with suspicion but was now studied with fervent hope. His smile dissected, his nods recorded, his enemies quietly erased from favor. The air in the royal apartment was choked with rosewater and dread, as if the body on the bed were both sacred and profane, a holy object fouled by the smell of rotting flesh and the political inconvenience of its refusal to die quickly. Some wept genuinely, perhaps, but most simply stared, their grief a performance for each other, for posterity, and for the ghost of a monarch who once could turn courtiers to stone with a glance, but now could not lift his own head. Servants shuffled in and out with basins, cloths, and potions, their movements rehearsed and numb, while the king drifted in and out of a haze laced with laudanum and silence, his lips moving occasionally in prayer or recollection, though few could tell the difference. Madame de Maintenon, cloaked in shadow at the corner of the room, watched not just the man, but the performance herself, both mourner and stage manager, ensuring no one broke the spell of royal dignity, even as the physical truth of the king defied all illusion. It was a death observed like a solar eclipse, directly, briefly, and through layers of symbolic shielding, lest the raw truth blind them all. And as the courtiers left the room, their faces quickly resumed the expressions of intrigue and guarded ambition, for the king was no longer a ruler but an obstacle, a decaying bulwark against the future that had already begun to assemble itself in whispers and gestures. He had become history in real time, and as his breathing grew shallower and the room darkened with candle smoke and unspoken calculations, the court watched not to mourn, not to pray, but to position, to pivot, to survive the death of a god by preparing to serve whoever wore the next illusion of immortality. His mind, astonishingly lucid, clung to ritual and recollection, issuing orders in a voice grown faint yet still unmistakably sovereign. But the vessel that bore it, the flesh once wrapped in silks and gilded brocade, the body that had once danced ballets and ridden at the head of army shad, begun its final, irreversible collapse. The gangrene, no longer confined to the leg, had marched up his thigh and now spread inward, poisoning his blood, his organs, his breath, until even the attendants tasked with standing nearest to him had to rotate hourly to avoid collapse from the fumes. His skin, once powdered and admired, now blistered with sores that burst and wept a pale yellow fluid, each one a silent scream against the pomp that still filled the palace beyond his chamber. The fever returned in waves, seizing him with chills that rattled the canopy bed, then baking him in sweat so thick it glued the sheets to his thighs. His groans long, drawn out, animal sounds punctured the heavy silence of the royal apartments, echoing into galleries where courtiers stood frozen like statues, unsure whether to flinch or kneel, while surgeons hovered like pale scavengers, recording every symptom as though cataloging a sacred relic under siege. His tongue swelled, cracked, and bled, his nails blackened, his breath soured to the stench of stagnant meat, and through it all, he continued to speak, to rule, to instruct the future as his body screamed mutiny beneath the weight of dignity. Sometimes he spoke to those present, sometimes to ghosts Mazarin, perhaps, or his mother, or one of the many sons whose coffins had preceded him, and sometimes to no one at all, muttering fragments of prayers, treaties, regrets too fragmented to decode. His eyes, sharp as ever, remained open even as his eyelids sagged, staring not at the walls of Versailles but at something beyond them, something only he could see, or perhaps refused to see, because to close his eyes would be to yield, to consent to extinction. And all the while, the physicians, Fagon, Mareschal, and their desperate acolytes shivered at the bedside, applying poultices, draining abscesses, prescribing draughts of opium and holy water, knowing with growing certainty that they were not treating a man, but performing a medical liturgy at the altar of decay. The court had long ceased pretending he would recover, but they had not ceased pretending he was sovereign, and so his broken body was paraded through final ceremonies like a hallowed artifact, draped in symbols even as its cells liquefied beneath the surface. The contradiction widened with every hour. His decrees still carried royal weight, even as pus seeped through the bed linens and into the mattress beneath him. He had become a paradoxa monarch who ruled in name, and a corpse in waiting who groaned in pain, no longer feared, no longer envied, only watched, like a fire dwindling into embers that refused, with unbearable slowness, to go out. The 31st of August arrived not with trumpets but with trembling, a gray morning that seemed suspended outside of time, as if even the sun refused to rise fully on what Versailles had already begun to understand would be the king's last day. The chamber was dim, lit by the soft quiver of candles whose flames bent and straightened with every shifting breath of the dying man, whose chest rose unevenly beneath damp linen, every inhale a battle, every exhale a siege. Priests stood at the foot of the bed, murmuring psalms into the heavy air, their voices barely audible over the rasp of royal breath, shallow, wet, gurgling like rain in a gutter, and still they chanted, words colliding with incense smoke in a room where the sacred and the grotesque had become indistinguishable. Louis slipped in and out of lucidity, his eyes sometimes fluttering open, fixing momentarily on the crucifix held before him, other times rolling upward into a white void of half-conscious agony, his mouth working around syllables that may have been prayers, orders, or simply the fragmented echo of memory cracking beneath the weight of fever. The leg, now fully blackened, had split open during the night, ruptured like overripe fruit, spilling a slow trickle of foul liquid into the already saturated linens, and though the servants changed them again and again, the stench had become something eternal, clinging to the tapestries, saturating the seams of gold thread, embedding itself in the folds of the velvet curtains that had once concealed lovers, ministers, and now the unspeakable decay of absolute power. No physician touched him now, not truly, for all had acknowledged, silently, that nothing remained to be done but to watch and to record, to preserve the theater of majesty even as its lead actor drowned in his own failing blood. His limbs twitched intermittently, a death dance of frayed nerves, while the court whispered just beyond the chamber doors, hoping to be near enough for history, but far enough to avoid its smell. Madame de Maintenon knelt silently at the corner, lips moving but producing no sound, her gaze fixed on the candlelight that trembled like the final pulse of the rain itself. The silence in the room was total, save for the wheeze of the king's lungs and the soft rustle of vestments as the grand almoner stepped forward for what would be the final blessing. And then, sometime in the early hours, as the last candle bent once more under an invisible breath, the sound stopped. No gasp, no final word, only the sudden absence of struggle, the vanishing of noise so long endured that its disappearance seemed louder than its presence. The room did not move, did not cry, did not pray louder, because death had arrived, as Louis had always insisted, not in chaos, but in silence, not as a thief, but as a courtier, invited, expected, choreographed, and as the wax dripped, as the chamber grew impossibly still, the man who ruled for 72 years ceased, not with thunder but with flicker, not with finality but with stillness, and nothing. At precisely 8:15 in the morning on the 1st of September, 1715, the heartbeat of France stopped not with fanfare or celestial rupture, but with a final, rattling breath expelled into a room thick with decay, where velvet curtains sagged with damp and candles guttered beneath the weight of their own wax. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was dead, and though he had ruled longer than any monarch in European history, the moment of his passing bore none of the grandeur he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Instead, it was marked by silence, by the dull slap of saturated linens being lifted from a bed that now held not a god, but a carcass. His face, long praised for its composure and symmetry, had slackened into a grimace, jaw askew, skin sunken and yellowed, eyes half-lidded as if unsure whether to close entirely. The attending priests crossed themselves in solemn rhythm, whispering prayers not for salvation, but for order, because the machinery of monarchy could not grieve. It could only continue. Outside the chamber, the bells of Versailles rang in slow, methodical tolls, their sound muffled by the thick morning mist, while inside, surgeons prepared for the grim duty of royal partition, his heart to be entombed at the Jesuits, his entrails in Notre Dame, and his embalmed body destined for Saint Denis. Each piece of the king dispersed across the sacred geography of his kingdom like relics of a broken idol. But even this ritual was stained by the physical truth: his body, so ravaged by infection, was nearly impossible to preserve. The internal organs liquefied by gangrene, the veins bloated and brittle, the skin tearing beneath the pressure of putrefaction before the embalmers could complete their work. Despite the gold crucifixes, the relics, the chants, and the wax-sealed proclamations, there was no escaping it. Death had arrived not with fire, but with pus, not with divine light, but with the grotesque betrayal of flesh, a rebellion of cells that no decree could silence. The courtiers, their faces composed in a theater of sorrow, began to disperse, some bowing one last time, others already whispering allegiances to the Duke of Orléans or calculating their positions under the infant king. Madame de Maintenon disappeared into a side chamber, neither widow nor queen, only a shadow of memory now stripped of function. And Versailles, always a temple of appearances, began its transformation into a mausoleum, a palace whose golden walls now echoed with absence. Outside, the fountains still flowed, the peacocks still screamed in the gardens, but the air had changed thicker, slower, touched by a quiet no music could mask. Louis XIV had sculpted himself into a myth, a sun without shadow, a king whose will had bent the architecture of an entire nation. But in the end, it was not his triumphs nor his monuments that wrote the final chapter, but his decay, his gasping, stinking, twitching death, a scene of such visceral collapse that it pierced the veil of propaganda and left only this truth, that no reign, no matter how absolute, can outrun the stench of its own ending. The corpse of Louis XIV, still warm when the embalmers arrived with their silver instruments and scented oils, was no longer treated as a man but as a holy relic to be disassembled with ritual precision. For the death of a king was never a private end, it was a public process, a state sacrament, a sacred autopsy carried out beneath the gilded cornices of Versailles. His heart was carved out first, carefully placed in a crystal urn bound for the Jesuit church in Paris, still dark with clotted blood that stained the silk gloves of the surgeons. His entrails, fouled and liquefied by gangrenure harder to claim, sloshed into vessels destined for Notre Dame, their corruption masked by layers of amber and myrrh. And finally, the body itself, wiped clean but still exuding the scent of its final rebellion, was embalmed and dressed in regal finery, wrapped in white linen, and laid within a coffin of oak and lead, as if layers of metal might suppress what had bloomed inside. 3 remains, 3 sacred centers, each becoming a point of pilgrimage for a nation in need of narrative. And Versailles, a furnace of ambition, draped itself in mourning. Tapestries were turned, mirrors veiled, curtains drawn tight against the light that once symbolized his name. Court musicians played dirges, black-clad servants wept on cue, and the fountains flowed as if imitating tears, but beneath the heavy pageantry was a current of something else, something almost blasphemous: relief. For with the king's final breath, the unbearable tension of his lingering agony had lifted, and with it, the paralysis of a court frozen by fear of transition. Now, with the sovereign no longer present to command obedience or suppress doubt, the question of succession reared its many-headed form, twisting through salons and antechambers like smoke through keyholes. Would the Duke of Orléans truly hold the regency? Would the Duke of Maine contest it? Would the legitimized sons be elevated or erased? The corpse was not yet cold, yet already power had shifted rooms, entering whispers, postures, glances, each noble recalibrating their fate against the weight of a child king and the vultures gathering around him. Messengers were dispatched, alliances sealed in secret chambers, and those who had hovered close to the deathbed now hovered closer to influence, wiping away their grief with the efficiency of men who understood that in monarchy, mourning was a performance and succession was survival. The royal body, meanwhile, was placed in state, surrounded by candles and crimson drapery, as if to preserve its dignity through sheer aesthetic force. Though even embalming could not fully arrest the signs of decay beneath the perfumes and prayers, the king's lips darkened, his fingers stiffened, and the illusion of eternal power slowly gave way to the realities of decomposition. In time, the cortege would carry him to Saint-Denis, that necropolis of kings. But for now, in the hours after his death, his corpse lay both sacred and strategic, an object of reverence and leverage, around which France grieved, schemed, and began, quietly and hungrily, to forget. It took 76 years for the silence of Saint-Denis to be shattered, not by choral hymns or royal funerals, but by the steel of revolution and the roar of a nation unmaking its myths. For in October of 1793, beneath a gray Parisian sky bruised with storm and rage, a band of Jacobin zealots broke open the royal necropolis with picks, torches, and rifles, determined to tear out the roots of monarchy not just from law, but from the earth itself. They came not to mourn but to mutilate, dragging centuries of kings from their crypts like vermin from a cellar, tossing bones into open pits, hacking at effigies, smashing marble tombs with the ferocity of generations gagged by etiquette and hunger. Louis XIV, embalmed in perfume, linen, and legend, was no exception. His massive, lead-lined coffin split like a loaf, the remains within still wrapped in shreds of ancient cloth, the smell no longer of sanctity but of slow, royal rot. His skeleton, though disarticulated by time, still bore traces of grandeur, the jaw strong, the limbs long, the ribcage partially collapsed but unmistakably human, and yet in that moment, he was no longer Le Roi Soleil, only one more dead man in a trench of dethroned ancestors. The mob did not care that his reign defined an era, that he had danced ballets and dictated borders. They spat on his bones, hurled them like curses into mass graves beside his kin, stripping away the last pretense of divine right, of sacred flesh, of legacy protected by velvet and Versailles. The tomb was emptied, the name desecrated, and yet the story did not end in that revolutionary pit. For years later, across the channel in the drawing room of a curious Englishman, a final act of grotesque satire would unfold. During the 19th century, the preserved heart of Louis XIV, entombed with solemnity at the Jesuits' church in Paris, had been looted, passed between collectors, displayed like a curiosity, and ultimately purchased by one William Buckland, a geologist and eccentric who, upon acquiring the shriveled relic, reportedly did the unthinkable. He ate it, with neither prayer nor ceremony. The heart of a god-king was consumed like jerky, a morsel of monarchy reduced to digestion, its sanctity dissolved in stomach acid, its symbolism chewed into farce. Thus the man who had once bent Europe to his will, who had choreographed his own death and dismemberment into relics to be worshipped, found his remains not in marble, but in the belly of an amateur scholar. His legacy, like his body, scattered across trenches, across time, across the very nation he once claimed to embody. The bones of France's most absolute monarch had become anonymous dust, the heart a punchline, and the myth, once burned into the soul of a kingdom, now fermented into the grotesque comedy of human history, where kings rot, nations revolt, and relics are swallowed with tea in the drawing rooms of empire. In the end, Louis XIV's death was not a rupture but a mirror, a slow, pus-slicked echo of everything his reign had always been: control, rotting into delusion, ceremony collapsing beneath the weight of pain, and a golden spectacle reduced to the grotesque reality of human suffering. He had spent 70 years constructing a kingdom in his image, curating each corner of Versailles, scripting the hours of his court down to the breath, bending nobles into ornaments and rituals into doctrine, believing perhaps truly that divine authority could be choreographed like a dance, and maintained like a machine. And yet, when his body failed, all that control revealed its hollow core. The courtiers could not stop the stench, the physicians could not halt the gangrene, and no amount of candlelight or Latin prayers could reverse the decomposition that began not in the kingdom, but in his own flesh. This was the final contradiction of absolutism, its most perfect expression dying in a bed soaked with pus, giving orders through clenched teeth while his leg blackened and split beneath the sheets. As powerless as any peasant to stop the advance of decay, his was a reign obsessed with containment of information, of dissent, of time itself. and yet the decay that killed him spread precisely because it was denied, misnamed, treated not as truth but as error in perception. Much like the descent he crushed or the famines he refused to see, his death did not defy his rulite, revealed it, laid it bare, exposed its moral and corporeal foundation, that beneath all the gold and marble, power is a fragile architecture that cannot halt a single cell from dying, a single artery from hardening, a single breath from silencing itself forever. The image of a man who once rearranged the map of Europe, now lying helpless as surgeons debated whether to remove his leg. Too old, they whispered, too late, and did nothing, is not just a tragedy, it is a parable of grandeur undone by its own illusion. And what did it mean? That this king who ruled with such omnipresence, who declared l'état, c'est moi, died whispering fragments of regret to a child too young to grasp them? What legacy is left by a monarch who orchestrated every second of his rule and yet could not script his own ending? His death, like his life, became a theater, only now the audience recoiled rather than applauded, and the curtains were stained with blood and infection rather than brocade. The myth of the Sun King did not end with fire. It curdled into pus, it slouched into silence, and still the legend endured, because power, once shaped into ritual, survives even as the flesh that bore it liquefies. In this, Louis's final days become more than history, they become prophecy, a reminder that every empire, every system of control, no matter how polished or divine it may seem, carries within it the seed of collapse, and sometimes that collapse begins not with revolution, but with a wound that refuses to heal. He died not beneath a gilded dome of celestial triumph, but beneath a sagging canopy reeking of vinegar and gangrene, his body bloated and blistered, his breath shallow, his prayers muttered through cracked lips as pus stained the linens meant for posterity. And yet, in the centuries that followed, Louis XIV did not linger in the public mind as a man who decayed, but as a monarch who dazzled, the golden sovereign of an age still called his own, le roi soleil, eternal, radiant, absolute. Such is the paradox of power, that the truth may rot in private while the myth glitters in the open, immune to stench, immune to suffering. His deathbed was not a place of glory, it was a theater of failure and flesh, where every ritual gesture only underscored how little remained to be ruled, where the machinery of court life moved forward like clockwork, even as its master slipped between seizures and silences. Yet despite the groans, the oozing sores, the failed incisions, and the whispered panic of physicians helpless before their own instruments, the image of Louis as God-King endured, not just in marble and portraiture, but in memory, clean, perfected, immune to rot. And so we are left with the final question, the question his entire reign seems constructed to provoke. Was his power found in the absolute control he wielded in, the wars he waged, the laws he decreed, the court he choreographed, or in the story he left behind? The illusion so vivid that it outlived even the desecration of his tomb, the dismemberment of his body, the devouring of his heart by a curious Englishman? He was not the first to die in pain, nor the last to hide it behind ceremony, but he may have been the first to render agony into spectacle so seamlessly that it vanished beneath the glitter of it all. The myth of Louis XIV was not destroyed by his end, it was preserved by its erasure, by the silence that fell over the rot, the scripted grieving, the refusal to let a sovereign be remembered as mortal. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of monarchy, not that it claims divinity, but that it convinces others to believe it, even when the god is gasping for air and leaking from the leg. In that flickering candlelight of his final hours, something monstrous and magnificent took shape, not just the death of a man, but the triumph of a narrative, a symbol perfected, even as the symbol-bearer collapsed. And so we close not with certainty, but with a question that hangs like incense in a vaulted hall. Was Louis XIV's true genius in how he ruled France, in how he made the world forget that he too was made of skin, of blood, of breath, and finally, of silence?